For many reasons that will be discussed tonight, this book is a critical intervention in the history of citizenship in Africa and France and beyond. And it will have a lasting impact on our understanding of citizenship, migration, cultural and religious pluralism, the shape and transformation of French public space, and its moral and political economies, ideas, and ideas about integration, assimilation, etc. One thing I would like to notice in this introduction is that the book is already available in French under the title Français et Africains, Aide citoyenne au temps de la décolonisation. And it has already been reviewed in the Monde des Livres. And I would like to quote the last sentence of the review. I will quote it in French, I will translate it in English. But I don't think that it's necessary in this space, which is the Maison Française. The last sentence of the review is interesting because it signals quite nicely the importance of the book and the debates it will provoke in France and in Africa. I, was aware of the book in French because my colleague back in Dakar and people I actually studied in French informed me about the book and had begun a discussion about it back in Dakar. And they were so frustrated because Fred was supposed to go to Dakar and they were looking forward to a discussion. Unfortunately, Fred was not able to make it. But let me go back to this quote. The quote I took from the review says, récit magistral, français et africain met en lumière comme rarement les acteurs africains de notre histoire. A brilliant book, Imperial Citizenship, features the African actors rarely mentioned or evoked in our French history. What I would like to underline is precisely the expression, our French history, to underscore the complexity of the relationship of colonial violence, rights, and French Republican ideology in the rhetoric of French self-representation and exceptionalism. But we still need to ask a question which is probably at the heart of French thought. Which common history, which common memory are we referring to, talking about the common history of French and Africa, not only in the past during colonial rule, but in the present, in a situation in which what is at stake is again the identity, to quote a historian, the identity of France, which is the title of a book by Prolet. The tour de force achieved by Fred in this book is to bring back the colonial history of France and the colonial subject of the French Empire into the mainstream of French history.
So my brief here today was partly to give not exactly a précis, but at least a sense of the contours of the argument of this powerful book, and to offer a few brief reflections on it. And the book, which has only just come out, and many of you have not yet have had a chance to read it, or indeed to purchase it, although we're offering you the latter, and the former, I suppose, as well. The book pushes us to rethink what Cooper refers to as the conventional narrative of nationalist triumph, and he rejects the common view that in the 19th and 20th century, global history is marked by a long and inexorable move from the empire to the nation state. But what he does more specifically is to demonstrate that leaders of Africa and what he calls European France, necessarily calls European France, ended up with a form of political organization, the territorial nation state, I'm quoting, that few of them had sought in 1946, and which all but Guinea had rejected in 1958. So the real question behind the book is how could that have happened? Or at least one of the questions behind the book is how could that have happened? What African leaders, and perhaps their people, got was sovereignty, the contours and content of which remained to be determined. And what Africans, but also French, European French, lost was common citizenship in something bigger than a nation state. And so it's with this dual observation of the difference between the observation that a difference between the empire and the federation is not as great as one might think, and the observation that the nation state may come at a cost, indeed the cost of a certain loss of freedom and fewer protections. With this dual observation, Cooper retells the history of decolonization and national independence effectively as a failure. But he does so not with pessimistic and cynical hindsight, but in recognizing honestly the collective inability, mostly but not only for reasons beyond their control, of African and European French political leaders to reach durable accommodations, ones that could withstand both the demands of their respective constituents, as well as their fellow citizens more broadly, and also the dynamics of an intensely and rapidly polarizing world. That said, this is first and foremost a book about possibilities, as opposed to the way post-colonial history is very often told, almost instinctively told, as a history of impossibilities. And telling this history of possibilities seems enormously relevant today. The book is, above all, though, an exercise in a very rigorous form of historical reasoning. It refuses, this will be no surprise to you, especially those of you who read some of Fred's more recent work over the last decade or so, it refuses to get ahead of the story, and it cautions us again not to do history backwards, and to pay as much attention to what didn't happen as to what did, to pay as much attention to the possibilities that were foreclosed or shut down as to those which gave on to other possibilities. And by refusing to get ahead of the story, Fred Cooper creates a new story, in fact one that Leopold Senghor would recognize. The story that ending colonialism was not a single moment in French history, neither in 1946 with the Constitution of the Fourth Republic, nor in 1960, but in fact that it was a process, a long and convoluted process that no one effectively controlled. To go a step further, if this ending of colonialism did have a moment, or at least was punctuated by one above all others, it could equally be 1958, when, as Cooper points out, states, or territories, but really states, voted on whether or not to adhere to the French community, that is, to a new federation bound by a constitution to which they themselves had contributed, and dubbed with a neologism elaborated by one of their representatives. But the emphasis here is on process, on the historical process, pursued via both a meticulous study of political discourse and the conscientious tracing of verbal gymnastics and circumlocutions across an enormous number of texts, long-winded debates, and parliamentary records. The leaders of Africa and European France, as Cooper points out, were working within a mutually intelligible space. Cooper points out there were in fact other spaces, but his interest is precisely in this mutually intelligible and this shared space. It's one in which community and nation were extraordinarily unstable terms in 1958, again in 1959, again in 1960, more than once in 1960. The meaning of both of those terms was changing very rapidly, year to year and even more rapidly. This mutually intelligible space is an extraordinarily tight one, and sometimes it's even almost a claustrophobic one. I can feel the debates going on within the National Assembly and within the various ministries and other bodies, and not within the new Fidesz-funded territorial assemblies in West Africa and Equatorial Africa, for example. This sounds bleak to say this is a book about failure that took place over a long period of time in a grinding process in claustrophobic spaces. It is a little bit bleak. It's the history of a decade-long part of it is the history of a decade-long legislative paralysis. Let me just repeat that phrase, a decade-long legislative paralysis. That sounds familiar too to our times. A decade-long legislative paralysis over voting rights and civil status, which revealed both the political and the ideological limits of the reforms of 1946. It's a long history of tactical stalemates and strategic failures. But I don't want to make it sound like some kind of antiquarian excursion into a dead letter office, which is a phrase that kept ringing in my mind in the first few chapters. It's instead a singularly compelling history of failure. If you want to read a history of failure, this is the one to read. Failure's not so bad after all. Hayden Center's having an event on Bob Dylan right now. So I will quote, "She knows there's no success like failure, and failure is no success at all." The first half of the book largely is about the design of the Fourth Republic and later the Fifth. The second half largely is around practice or implementation or fabrication. I struggle here for a word, but actually it's about improvisation, is the word I landed on. Improvisation of some new form of political community, with a small c and not a capital C, some new form of political community that had to be changing constantly in reaction partly to what was happening in Maghreb, but also beyond. The battle with which the book begins to secure citizenship in 1946 ends with an effective draw. Citizenship was obtained, but neither universal suffrage nor a single college was, nor for that matter were strong territorial assemblies secured. So the Remaking law was one step and a necessary step in a political evolution. I hesitate over that term. But the battles around it came to a draw. And in spite of some, so we recognize this book as a history of certain kinds of failure, in spite of some apparent and even sometimes blinding successes. The Remaking law assuring citizenship being only amended, but also successes along the complementary axes of social and political citizenship. And that's an important complementarity that Cooper works with throughout the book. Some successes along the complementary axes of social and political citizenship. For the Code du Travail, or the Labor Code of 1952, which represented the power of the argument for material equivalence of citizens in the mid-1950s, securing equal pay for equal work in the wake of significant labor struggles in West Africa, but also a good deal of parliamentary movement. Another success, but now one we see as a failure, but then seen as a success. The Framework Law, the Loi Cadre of 1956, which secured universal suffrage, a single college, single electoral college. We don't have a single college here at Columbia, a single electoral college. Power to territorial assemblies. Therefore was seen as a kind of a victory, at least in the moment in which it occurred. And later its cost will be weighed differently. But the Loi Cadre represented a political accommodation to the very real cost of the logic of material assimilation that the Code du Travail secured. And with it, France traded power and authority, that is European France, traded power and authority for protection from social demands. The book ends, however, with a pair of resounding failures. That of the Mali Federation and the community, which Cooper insists were tied, that the aspirations of both the community and of African unity hung on the Mali Federation, and at the end, the community and federation failed together. And also the failure of Léopold Sédar Senghor and Mamadou, who were forced to pivot to a defense of Senegalese nationality, Sénégalité, to a nation-state nationalism, abandoning the intellectual work, the intellectual scaffolding that Senghor had constructed with great effort over decades, abandoning the political principles that were dearest to them, and arguing in the wake of the collapse of the Mali Federation in 1960 that a nation-state nationalism had to first prevail. And there are almost poignant passages from Senghor proclaiming the virtue of nation-state nationalism, Sénégalité, in his particular didactic style to his constituents, but also in writing directly to Félix Houphouët-Boigny to acknowledge that his concrete possibilities, both federalism, which Houphouët-Boigny had championed, and confederation, which Senghor had, were dead. So to come to a conclusion, the book asks how it happened that political actors of France and French West Africa ended up with a form of political organization that neither had wanted during most of the previous 15 years. 15 years of very hard political work. And here we encounter one of these paradoxes that was common in colonial discourse decades earlier, in which conquest was characterized as a form of liberation. Here we recognize nationalist victory as in fact Pan-African, perhaps anti-colonial defeat. So what I wanted to ask Fred was how he would characterize the future that was foreclosed at this moment of defeat. And given the failure of 1960, was the optimism of 1946, of 1956, of 1958, was that optimism misplaced entirely? There's another question I wanted to pose. Well, I have two questions. We must deal with that. The question I wanted to pose, I think is an interesting argument in the book, is that the Senegalese model of a differentiated form of citizenship, that is, having political citizenship without being required to give up one's personal status, effectively an accommodation that had been elaborated across the 19th century and into the 20th, defended, lost briefly, defended again. That the Senegalese model, to have citizenship without giving up one's personal status, Fred argues that this becomes the basis for a part of French law. It becomes a model that spreads. And that it poses a fundamental challenge: how to reconcile universalistic or egalitarian views of citizenship with the particularity of African cultures. The struggle here, in fact, as it happened, was a struggle for African leaders to insist that France transform itself into a polity that was multicultural as well as egalitarian. This is a struggle that sounds extraordinarily familiar. I suppose the question I wanted to ask, and I would like to hear a little more about it, is in fact a very minor question, is this argument about personal status, about universalistic views of citizenship balanced against the particularity of African cultures, seems to me euphemistic in some sense. Because the real question at stake, and Mamadou is clear about this, and others are clear about it as well, that the real question at stake is not African cultures writ large, but precisely African Muslim culture, precisely the practice of Islam by African Muslims, and the way that affects their civil status in particular. I'm not sure if that's fodder for further reflection, but I thought I would pose it as a rough question. Thank you.
So instead of really like being in a dialogue with Fred and asking questions, I want you to maybe give you, make you want to read this book, not just come here, but read the book, and maybe think with you about what we're doing as historians today, like today, now in 2015, and when we speak about these issues, and also try to think about the genre, the historical genre in which this book is inscribed. In the era of the triumph of intellectual history, of the intellectual history of concepts, I think that Fred offers an alternative which is more like a political history of concepts, and that's a very important distinction to make, I think, a very important contribution. I'm saying that because the integrity of Fred's book, which was very well summarized and explained by Greg, is devoted to insisting, it seems to me, on the very volatility of concepts, how very fast concepts can move, and also how very fast political formations can move. So actually, I'm not sure I would completely agree with Greg characterizing the book as a history of paralysis. It's actually a history of movement, of how the concept of citizenship completely turned upon itself several times between 1944 and 1954 and 1960. And also how empire, the very definition of what empire was for the French and the Africans at the time, moved quickly, how federation was in and then was out, and how you maintain an empire and how you defend an empire changed dramatically. And that is, of course, those 400 plus pages, that's one of the things that stylistically almost, maybe it's true that now I work in the French department, stylistically, Fred does, is like really capturing the volatility of things. Things move very quickly. They're not paralyzed, actually, they move.
Paralysis is a quote from Fred, but it's only 46 to 50. This period is one decade of paralysis, legislative paralysis, not conceptual paralysis.
Yes, but the people think these concepts, very. They fail. It's true. This history of failure. They fail to impose, ultimately alternative definitions of those concepts. But they make them work. So they make them do a lot of work, and that's in different ways. And I find that very interesting, very useful, applied to France, to French history, because one of the things that I think, as a historian of France, that I found most important, I think, today, is to actually get rid of the form of French culturalism that that you find in many different formulations, that by either approving or criticizing something like the idea of a republic with its long durée history of concepts like citizenship that implies necessarily the idea of universalism and of the indivisibility of the republic and of the very concept of citizenship that implies secularism. So all these things associated together, it says since the revolution, since even Rousseau maybe, that there would be a very stable concepts that is imposed on us as both historians and maybe also as citizens, is something that this kind of political history of concepts does, showing that the political work that concepts can do in a very short amount of time. And that leads me to my main comment is about the political uses of history in our times. It is not at all an antiquarian project in the sense that what Fred suggests for us to do by looking at this very active, very volatile 14 years is actually to flex our imaginations, to extend our imaginations. And what he suggests, I think in the end, is try to think today about what we can do with these concepts that, like sovereignty, like citizenship, like nationality, that are at the center of some of the most important debates in contemporary France. And obviously, and that's what I want to insist, is that, you know, is providing us with a form of historical critique about different ways in which today we can think about integrating people in the French community, in the French polity, on the basis of their different culture. That doesn't imply a very crystallized vision of secularism, and so I'm going back here to the end of Greg's comment. In time of despair in France about values that seem Republican values that seem completely inoperative, inefficient, values that are seem to have lost meaning. I think this kind of history is actually very useful for the contemporary historical debate in France to help people understand the flexibility of this concept, the work that these political concepts can do, and try to think about new forms of building political communities that are based both on equality and inclusion and respect for cultural difference, as it was in the debates preceding the Constitution of 1946, or as it was in the late 50s. So, in a way, I'm going to rephrase the question that I asked Fred at NYU. I don't know if you remember, but my question was at the end, why bother? So the history is a history of, it's true, of ultimate failure of those openings. So there was an opening between, let's say, there was different kinds of openings between 44 and 1960, where citizenship could have been rephrased in a much more pluralistic way, where religious difference, that is to say, where Islam and forms of collective behaviors associated with them could be integrated in French citizenship. Why bother telling the story if at the end this opening closes, if there is a closure? And I mean, we had a little discussion about that. Why doing that kind of history? And I think today it's an extremely important moment for doing that history in France after January 7th and January 9th. It's very important to have this kind of history because it gives us some critical tools to think about the different ways of organizing the French politics. So I should buy this book just to give you some hope. That's all.
I would like to preface my comments by saying that I have read the book, I have read the manuscript of the book, and I have engaged into discussion with Fred about the book and the way he had been conceiving it. And I'm coming back, and this is really my preface to, I think that the book is about what happened to the ideology of the French Republic when you are thinking about France from the empire, not from the center, but from the periphery. And it, I think, destabilizes many of the concepts which are the pillar of French self-representation, the pillar of citizenship, the pillar of nationality, but also the pillar of secularism, which is laicity, which connect with Greg's concluding question. So, the first comment I would like to make is to say that this is a very important book, which is based on a very rich archive, including a prodigious amount of new archival research, in particular in the French police and intelligence documents, but also in the political archives of French leaders. And it's look at the moment. I think my two colleagues have talked about the moment. And this is probably the first important intervention of Fred Cooper, is to say that finally we are not paying attention in defining that moment. And the definition is important to understand what has really happened, or which kind of question we can ask, and is the tension which the important structure of thinking of Fred between what he called, possibilities and constraints. Why some options are realized and others fail. The notion of failure is something very important. But if we say this is a moment defined by the crisis of French Empire, we have already taken an option about what. But if we say it is a moment which defines the rise of nationalism in West Africa, we are also taking a different direction and pointing at specific features to qualify that moment. Fred avoids that by using a kind of very interesting expression. He says it is a moment of profound uncertainty. And that characterization precisely allowed him to actually test what he thinks is the task of the historian. Not look at things from a teleological way, but look at precisely given moment using these different options which are on the table. And based on that, I think it provides a new frame for understanding the debate, this moment gave rise to, between colonizers and colonized, but also within each group. And I think the traveling between actually those different structures is very important to understand, to go back to what Emmanuelle was saying, that what the debates attest is the ambiguous, unsettled, and contested nature of legal and political concepts such as citizenship, sovereignty, nationality, rights, whose meaning and the reality associated to them are constantly reconfigured by the claim made on their name. And the idea that claims are shaping not only the practices, but also the discursive production are, I think, the second very important contribution of Fred. It's a contribution on history writing, and it's a contribution about how historical questions should be framed, let's say. So, as I was saying, Fred proposes to investigate the post-World War II moment as a moment of uncertainty, characterized by an intense debate about the future of the French Empire, colonies and metropole, debates taking place in different sites. This is also an important aspect Greg mentioned, because you have a territorial site, and it's unclear at different moments if it is an important site in relation to another site, which is the federal or confederate. Senghor situated himself into it. We can think of what he had at the moment during the creation of the RDA situating himself in a federal site, but at of a moment, in particular in the 50s, looking at it from a much more territorial. It's also possible to think of the site which is the national metropolitan, because we sometimes forget that some African leaders are much more powerful. And one of them which is important, and I will finish to that, it will be my question, is Lamin Gaye, who's moving back and forth between being a metropolitan politician to trying to be a federal politician after achieving the very fact that already in the 20s he became a local politician, but local in the sense of Senegal, or the four communes are a French province, you know, like the Languedoc or whatever. So this is an important thing. But you have also, and this connects this book and the book Africa in the World, another site which is a very important site is the Pan-African site, which is also part of this discussion. So it involves various actors who mobilize multiple resources, multiple, you know, political technology, rhetorical devices to make claim. But they are making the claim in the context and space where it matters the most, the space of political representation. And Greg has said, has mentioned, I think, an aspect of this book. Fred invests a lot in understanding institutions, in understanding ways in which institutions are inhabited. And for me, you know, it expresses ways in which the two categories of governance which are involved in the empire are being tested, received. But the category of government, when you are governed, you are represented. When you are administered, you are not. And I think this is an important aspect to understand ways in which citizenship is produced out of the claims. And the claims are made in, I think, Fred shows it also clearly, in two spaces. In a kind of very practical space, the space of practices, where people are improvising, where sometimes people are adjusting, where they are negotiating or in conflict. It's the space of politics, the space of trade union, the space of institution. Fred had, I mentioned his book on decolonization. I mentioned, you know, what he has done about strikes and things like that. And the labor question seems to be an essential part of this debate. And the second space, which is also a very, very important space, is the discursive space. And I think that, you know, to do a detour, Fred talks about culture, the impact of cultural studies, of colonial and post-colonial in the discussion, and the way in which they are part of Emmanuelle's and Harry, of the anxiety of French intellectuals, you know, in relation to the history of empire. And I can give many examples. But what is important is this space, which is the space of knowledge production, the discursive space in which the encounter is a kind of continuous engagement. Greg talked about Emmanuelle also, between the cultural and the intellectual quality required from the Bureau of Rights and Responsibility to demarcate the territory within which national membership is defined and attributed by the colonial administration on one hand. On the other, its contestation, mobilizing sophisticated epistemological re-evaluation of the concept of politics, ethics, reason, and universal civilization displaying specific modes of self-representation. The nation, and Fred do justice to this discussion in which Senghor and Mamadou were part of, is the shape of the nation. Is it unitary or multiple? The shape of the universal also. Is it plural and is it the product of what Senghor say, a symbiosis? Is the term he was using, I think, every day. What he called the production of a universal civilization based on a fusion of cultures. And this view profoundly marked his political imagination and understanding of what should happen. So for me, this is the first important intervention of his book. The second I have mentioned in passing is, and Greg have talked about, is the historiographical intervention. And I think it's important because the intellectual history discussion regarding how Africans are imagining their future within a tribal context of Africa, the French Empire, and global changes is illuminating in considering the intersecting constraints and possibilities each site and environment presents. It signals the importance of the actors, French and West African, their reflection on the discipline of history, which is an important aspect of this book, but also on history with a H, a big H, defined as the trajectory of human being, cultures and identity. But it's also about our own interpretation of the debate about history, of the debate about civilization, and the contribution or presence of African in global debate. And as I say, I think that, the nature of history and historical operation is one of the central themes of the book. And what Fred is looking is precisely this moment of junctures and disjunctures, to quote Brent Edwards, where you understand actually practices and ways in which they are actually reinterpreted and narrated becomes an important aspect of a discussion about the future of empire in a time of crisis. And citizenship, I think, covers realities, ideas and imagination about other concepts, political concept of autonomy, inclusion, exclusion, separation, subordination, creativity, and also the meaning of the republic, of republicanism, colonialism, and laicity. And this book does a great job dealing with all these very intertwined ideas. So the book is a real exercise in detecting the overlapping reading of history and politics in the mid-20th century and the contest over the concept that dominated the post-World War II. Decolonization, reform, modernization, development, and the demise of empire, and the mode of governance, cultural, the ethical value, and knowledge associated to that. So as I mentioned earlier, this discussion is also present in the Africa, in the world war. And I think that the shift in African history, Fred is operating outside the classical political, economic, and labor history territory. I think that Fred is opting out of what earlier made him this great historian of labor. I also mentioned that he's very cautious about, cultural, colonial and post-colonial studies. But one thing, and I would like to ask him, that his way of approaching the debate seemed also to be reconnecting with a 1950 debate about the nature of African history. Should it be written, contained within the continent, or should it be connected to the diaspora? Which is, I think, a very, a debate which was settled in the 60s with the creation of a Journal of African History and the idea that African history should be a continental history, but even it's not all the continent, because North Africa is and I think it's important because it's about the impact. For me it would be interesting to hear Fred about the impact of the shift. And for me, the shift is important, in particular, in relation to nationalist history, which is functionalist history, which is about a usable past. So what happened to this quest for a usable past when we adopt this kind of approach? And this has an impact about, assessing it as a failure or not. Because I think it's really about not only the nature of and intensity of the debate at a given moment, but what happened to the same debate in a trajectory which is much longer. The last question I would like to raise, and I will ask Fred, Greg touched on that. It's to understand this period he's looking at in relation to at least two periods which were also dominated by the discussion, about citizenship, political rights, and I underline that, cultural difference. And how can we account for the continuities and discontinuities between the period, considering the language of claim and the meaning of citizenship, as well as the resources which are mobilized. The two periods are, I think, connected by what Fred called a specifically French dimension of the discussion about citizenship, which is the claim that la France est une république une et indivisible. French is a republic one and indivisible. This is true for the discussion in the early period and in the period Fred is investigating. And it has configured the discussion and proposition about basically the relation between equality and diversity, between ethnicity, community, nation, and state, and their ethical values and political consequences. As you know, there is exactly the debate going on now in France. But it has begun. It's why, to reconnect with what I say in my, earlier, it has to do with the space in which the discussion is conducted. The metropolitan space, or the space of empire. But this is a discussion which has happened. This first period is the late 18th century, and the debate between the Senegalese originaire, people living in these four cities, and the colonial administration and traders on the issue of government, on the issue of representation versus administration, which is exclusion. The second period is the World War I context, where the 18th, 19th century discussion about the nature of the citizenship of the fourth commune is reopened in the context of the war and Blaise-Diagne's achievement in particular changing radically the understanding of citizenship. The Loi Blaise-Diagne of 1917 is a law which recognizes the full citizenship of the people of the fourth commune on the basis of two illegalities. One, they are located outside the civil code. Second, citizenship is granted to a community when it is supposed to be granted on an individual basis. So, for me, the interesting aspect, because we can complicate it by precisely showing how Blaise-Diagne, in his encounter with Du Bois in 1919, will actually use this French Republican library to contest, you know, the kind of Du Bois deployment of Pan-Africanism. So, I think on one hand, for this first period, what is interesting is that the debate about citizenship is not only a debate about legal rights, but it's a debate which is focusing on politics and political rights, because the originaires are not ready to give up their tradition, in particular their Muslim tradition. So they are fighting to include Islamic institution in the colonial public space. They are trying to convince the administration to accept borders, strict borders between the communities, each border policed by the leaders of the group. And Fred also shows it very well. This component of the debate is about membership, expressed in political terms, and belonging, expressed in cultural and psychological terms. So, in the first case, the discussion is about the content, about the assimilation project, and who should dictate its term. I'm not going to talk about the last part, because we have already discussed that in the second project. So my question is the continuities and discontinuities. Which things are surviving? Or are these two moments so different? Which will allow again to say something Fred discussed, is what it means at the point when Senghor and Boissier-Panon are talking about the Commonwealth à la Française in the discussion. What is the, did they understand really the meaning of the Commonwealth in the kind of situation? And lastly, what I would like to do, and I would like to praise Fred for that, is to have reintroduced in the discussion the first Prime Minister of Senegal, Mamadou. And this is a very, very important intervention, because he has completely disappeared after losing, the same struggle about the shape of the Senegalese state in 1962 after the failures. And recycling him back in the discussion is also very important in understanding better the shape of the discussion among African leaders.
Now, all three of the commentators have been involved in the gestation of this book. We've had many discussions along the way. I've had very useful comments on draft texts, and on two different occasions, 2 different years, Mamadou and I sat side by side in the Archives du Sénégal in Dakar and worked on our respective angles on citizenship questions. So we are continuing a discussion that has been ongoing for many years, and it's been a really great privilege to have been involved in all of the phases of this collaboration and shared so many ideas. I'd like to begin with the question that I think historians always should ask, and Emmanuelle did: why bother? And I think in some ways the answer is clearer now than it was before January 7th. Since then, we've seen the French government say that what we need to do is lecture people in the banlieue about the fact that they live in a republic, that they should be singing the Marseillaise, that when told they should be silent, and when told to participate in discussion, they should participate. The book clearly is about problematizing the very notion of republicanism that, rather than debate, the current government would like to impose. And they're doing this in a context where in France, as in most of the world, you're dealing with a reality of societies, seen small, seen large, that are differentiated, that are connected, and are unequal. So how do we deal politically with a world where difference, connection, and inequality are all part of the reality that has to be faced? Do we have the conceptual apparatus to think about it, and can we imagine institutions to deal with it? And what I'm doing in this book is saying that a group of people in the 1945 to 1960 period did think about precisely that. Whether their solutions were viable, whether their effort could be labeled a failure, nevertheless remains the fact that a set of possibilities was put on the table and seriously discussed by the brightest and the most influential political actors of the day, with opinions going across a wide spectrum. And while I don't say that any one model that came out of these debates is a model for France's future in its current situation, the very fact that you can call into question concepts is one that I think is relevant to our present and our future. And if there is an optimistic side of the reading of this book, and I think there is, it is to stress the possibility of alternative imaginings, and the possibility of turning these imaginings into concrete proposals for how to do something. Emmanuelle characterized this book as a political history of concepts, and in a way, Greg was referring to it as a conceptually oriented history of politics, for the destabilizing of concepts that we thought we knew, like nation, sovereignty, citizenship, is certainly one thing that the book does. But the other one, as Greg was quite correct to point out, it is a classic question of political history. How do people who are pushing for different kinds of things end up with a particular one of them? And as he pointed out, I don't like to get ahead of myself in writing this history, even though as somebody alive in 2015, and I've been working on this book since about 2000. So there's a number of presents that are involved in the writing of this book. But we know that. But in trying to reconstruct moments of possibility, we're trying to see what people's imagined futures were, and how, as some of them became enabled and others disabled, the matrix of possibility changes over time. I'm not sure that Greg's first question about was the optimism misplaced of 46, 56, and 58 is one I want to answer. I think the point is that the sense of possibility was real, and the people at that time had good reason. These were not pie in the sky ideas, and in some respects, the things that really seem implausible, if you think about it a certain way, actually turned out to be quite feasible. In the Aspect National Constitutional that wrote the Constitution of 1946, there were 6 deputies of African origin, non-citoyen, or representing non-citoyen. There were 6 of them, in an assembly of about 500 people. The model of citizenship that they were advocating was that of the Catholic community of Senegal, tiny enclaves that Mamadou has talked about. Yet that is the model that is written into the Constitution of 1946. And I think one can only explain it by the profundity of the uncertainty there, and that the old verities of how you ran an empire no longer are possible in that context. By the Senegalese model, what we mean is the citizens of overseas France, the territoire d'outre-mer, had the quality of the citizen without having to come under the civil code. We'll talk about some of the significance of that question later, but I wanted to get right away to a question that Mamadou poses about this book as being in some ways about how one writes history, which in some ways it is, but it's I'm writing about it by doing the history. And Mamadou alludes to the debate about, starting in the 1950s, went into the 1960s, about doing African history as the history of a continent, as what you might say an internalist view of African history. I'm old enough to have been very well aware of that debate in my own time, which my co-panelists are not, having been blessed by a younger age. And I went to graduate school. in 1969, and this debate was still very much there. And my cohort of graduate students, there was a lot of kind of peer pressure, not really from our mentors, but from our peers, that to do history of colonialism was too white. What we really needed to do was an authentically African history, even though some of us are white, to provide a usable past for the problems as they existed as of 1969, of fledgling states that were having their problems about expressing their coherence. And so a usable past was, in effect, a national past. And this fit in with a lot of what our first generation of African leaders were trying to do, is to construct themselves as père de la nation. And the question that kept getting posed in the subsequent years, and I think more by external events than by any new thinking within the academy, the external events I'm referring to is the economic crisis of the 1970s, was that you really can't write the history of a continent. That it is involved, that Africa exists in the world, and to do African history well, you're doing the history of Africa in relation to. Now, one of the arguments of my book is to make the same argument about the history of France. That you can't do the history of France by simply writing the history of France as a bounded entity moving through time. For the nature of that space is very much in question over that whole period of time. It's a question from Vercingetorix onward, and it still is. But we are dealing with with a period of attempting, in which many people had an interest in making this question not be a question. The Père de la Nation argument in Africa is really quite striking. In the case of Senghor, it's what you can document is practically the month or the day in which he disavowed his rejection of Sénégalité and advocated precisely that. I mean, if you date it to, if you want to be precise about it, it's August 20th, 1960, when the day the Mali Federation collapsed, with only a very few hints in a very short period of time, like in a matter of weeks before that he was about to make that move. Well, and another version of a usable past is to say a past in which one is looking at and taking seriously attempts in their time of dealing with a world that is differentiated, unequal, and connected. And in that sense, this is a book about a past that is usable, not because there are lessons that derive from the particular narration of that past, but the very process of narrating that past, looking at moments of uncertainty and moments when the set of possibilities is reconfigured is key. So clearly 1946 is one of those times. Then we have an interesting argument between Emmanuelle and Greg about whether we should be talking about volatility or paralysis. And in the sense that my book has provoked that argument, I can call it a success. Because this kind of argument is a good thing. But I hope I'm not just being polite by saying they're both right in different ways. For the paralysis ensued an aspect of the constitutional victory with which a lot of political actors in European France were quite uneasy. For the Constitution, the citizenship provision, but also the preamble. The preamble refers to nations and peoples in the plural, which is not something that is being referred to today by either the left or the right in France. What you're seeing, the Sunday march after the events of January was referred to as a march of unity. And as Mamadou pointed out, you're going back to 1789, you have these arguments about Invisible. Clearly what is going on in 1946 is the argument is being made that the France, if not necessarily the Republic, because there are nuances of where the Republic starts and where the Republic ends, but that France is divisible. It still may be une, but it's an une in the Senghorian sense of containing a multiplicity of civilizations. So at the one hand, that argument seems to be acknowledged in the preamble to the Constitution and in the provision of citizenship clauses that allow for people to be under different civil statuses. But then when it comes to dealing with the implications, well, then we see the paralysis. For one of the implications of it was the government should be able to keep track of its citizens in a way that accounts for their diversity. And in France, this means the état civil. But there ensues, starting in 1946, a great big argument about whether you could have multiple états civils or you had to have one. One would represent the unity of the Republic. Multiple would represent the fact that people have different civil statuses, and among other things, can marry differently. Under the civil code, monogamy is enforced. Under Islamic law, maximum 4 wives are allowed to a man, and in different African communities, a variety of marriage practices are allowed, as a variety of inheritance practices and filiation practices, all of which are governed in a relatively rigid way by the French Civil Code, all of which then are governed in a much more flexible way in the territoire d'outre-mer, but not in metropolitan France. Well, as of 1956, the French legislature is unable to agree on how to reorganize the État civil in order to take account of the rights that are guaranteed under the Constitution. So there's your paralysis. There was paralysis about the giving the territories real autonomy on internal affairs. So there too is your paralysis. But even in these 10 years, there was a great deal of volatility about the conceptual issue, and a huge debate that goes on about the nature of what we mean when we talk about nation. And is the nation French? Is the nation is France include multiple nations, including what? Senegalese or African? Senghor is trying to argue for an African nation, and he refers to beneath that there may be territories that can have a degree of autonomy the way that Departement does in European France. But there's also what he calls la petite patrie, which is often lost as an ethnic group. So there is a real ferment in which people can argue about what you want. And one of the big debates that becomes clearer after 1956 is between Senghor and Houphouët-Boigny, where Senghor wants to say there is an African nation that should be given an institutional structure, which he calls an African federation or a primary federation. Houphouët-Boigny says, we don't want this middle level. We want there to be we want to be in our territories, Côte d'Ivoire, Dahomey, etc., and we want to be part of France. And that France will be federal. There'll be nothing in the middle. Senghor also wanted a relationship with France, which he considered confederal. So here you have not only a debate about concepts, you have a debate about how you organize around those concepts into a political structure that you can put on an organization chart, and in which you can at least make an argument for its practical utility. So in that sense, we're not talking about theoretical debates about concepts. We're talking about something that's really pretty down to earth. And then what becomes known as the battle between federation and confederation, between Houphouët-Boigny and Senghor, is part of that. And by the way, on Senghor's side, on this question, not on others, but on this one, was Sékou Touré, who's often considered the most radical of African leaders, whereas Senghor is considered one of the more conservative. I don't think these labels mean much of anything. But on the question of a three-level structure, Senghor and Sékou Touré were in agreement. And so this kind of debate is telling you about concepts in politics and a politics built around arguments over concepts. And as Mamadou pointed out, these are debates not just between the French and the Africans, but among people who are French and among people who are African, and they reflect a kind of openness about alternatives. These debates are serious. One of the things the book does at what some might consider too great length is in looking at two constitutional debates, 46 and 58. I try to show how the outcome is different from what anybody might have expected it to be. There's a real process in these debates. I think this is fairly. And in the 46 case, it was a boycott of the assembly by the deputies from the colonies that broke the jam and made it possible to get what what people like Lamine Gueye and Léopold Senghor, in this case Houphouët-Boigny too, wanted. The 58 Constitution is often seen as being written by de Gaulle and Michel de Gaulle, his right-hand man. But in fact, if you follow the debate, those were the initial proposals. But the outcome turns out to be much more like what's a rule, or a more confederal structure, which can be agreed to as long as they didn't use the name. And the name that eventually was used was community. And that was suggested by the president of Madagascar, Tsiranana, and helps to break the logjam on the 58 Constitution. So there's a real dynamic in these moments where an operational blueprint is being written for a future society. And I think this kind of history is one that we should keep in mind, and on other kinds of issues to look at just where possibilities lie. History often tends to be written in terms of social people and social categories. Yet people are existing in a relational world, and these relationships are conflictual, and they're shifting, and hence the importance of emphasizing connections, even if the connections are asymmetrical, in some cases, extremely asymmetrical. So a lot of what we're talking about here, and I think the panelists are bringing this out very effectively, is both why and how you write a history in which the very units that you're writing about and the very terms in which you're using are not settled. This gives rise to the really crucial question of are we only talking about openness, or are we talking about closure? And clearly we're talking about closure too. That what opened up in 1946 was a debate in terms of which people would have thought you were crazy to engage in early on. A few people did, and they were treated as if they were crazy. Proposals were made to generalize citoyen technology statute over all the French Empire in the 1880s and again during World War I. They were rejected by very decisively. In 46, it goes through. So when we if we are trying to talk about openness and closures, it's not an even landscape in terms of temporality. There are situations in which possibilities open and situations in which they close. But the very fact that you can identify those in which the possibilities open means we should not assume that any closure is more than conjunctural too. It's not just the bizarreness of an opening, the extreme conditions that create it, but the way in which the actions of people create openings. Well, there's a whole lot in the commentaries that have been raised, but I don't want to go on too long. So let me just say a few things in response to questions that were raised. Gregory says that the Senegalese model of differentiated citizenship is really a kind of euphemism for talking about Islam. Today, it sounds more like it than it did at other times because of the way in which Islam stands in for otherness in today's France. But actually, the juridical issues as well as a lot of political issues apply as well to New Caledonia, for example, where it's not a Muslim, non-Muslim issue. It is an issue of differential status of different people within the regime. And some people come under the civil code, and some people do not. When you look at the term, if you read a lot of legislative debates, and I've read these things galore, and you read a lot of newspapers from the time, I've done a lot of that too. What you see on the part of a lot of politicians from European France, the issue they want to talk about when they're anxious about about trying to contain or even repress the multicultural element of that the 46 and 58 Constitution seem to apply. What they refer to constantly is polygamy. And clearly the provisions of the notion of Islamic law that allows for 1 to 4 wives is an element of it, but other African communities are polygamous as well, and most often the debates, the distinction is not made between the two. It's polygamy that's the stand-in for the extremes of cultural difference, and the question of how far France can go in recognizing them. But the ultimate question, I think, is one of a mono versus multi-cultural conception. Now, between that and the question of between and the juridical aspect of this, I mean, that's in a way what you can argue concretely about. You can say all sorts of things about culture, but here you're dealing with the state, and where the cultural issues are at stake in the state is how you regulate things in a juridical sense of the term. Now, the phase in which questions are open goes at least until the very end of the period that I talk about. In 1959, not only was there a debate about multiple statuses, there was no debate actually in multiple status in 1959. It was accepted. It was not controversial in the 58 Constitution. Where there was a debate in 1959 was about multiple nationalities. And the 58 Constitution says there is one citizenship, which is the citizenship of France and of the community. It says nothing about nationality. Constitutions usually don't. If the nation writes the Constitution, how can you define the nation in the Constitution? But then the issue came up among the leaders of African France. And de Gaulle's initial reaction, de Gaulle's initial reaction was, of course, there's only one nationality in the community, the French one. And almost all the African leaders are at least upset by this, and some, including Senghor and Mamadou, are strongly opposed to that notion. By December 1959, de Gaulle and Debré backed down. What they have said is that each member state, that's the term, can have its own nationality and write its own nationality law. That nationality will, in turn, confer the superposed nationality of the French Republic and of the community. La nationalité superposée de la République française et de la communauté. Now, this is actually quite amazing if you think about it from today, but it wasn't particularly amazing from the perspective of the 1950s. It's basically saying that a bureaucrat in Dakar can decide who is a Senegalese national, and therefore that person will have the right to enter France, to live in France, and to have access to schools and jobs, etc. under the Constitution of the Fifth Republic, and the principle of legal circulation is in place to this day. Well, these are the kinds of things that get reversed after the separation of citizenships in 1960. Interestingly enough, they don't get reversed immediately. And one of the key elements of the bargaining about independence in this period where people end up with something that wasn't their first choice was a softening of that in line with what they had before. The independence treaties guaranteed to former French citizens born before the date of independence the right to assert. They don't have to they can assert their French nationality. And they have the right of libre circulation continues. It continues until 1974. The reason why the French government agrees to this is they're much more worried about the rights of French citizens of the French Republic as it existed after 1960 to do business, own property, and have their rights protected when they were in Abidjan or Dakar, then they were worried about a bunch of Senegalese debarking in Marseille and asking for a job. And so you actually have a period from 1960 to 1974 where the separation of citizenship is softened, even after independence. So what we're dealing with here is a problem that occurs in the long and complex process by which empire becomes a post-imperial situation. It really is post-imperial in the sense of a trajectory that people have gone through, and in which a lot of the starting point was that empires frankly recognize that polities consist of multiple people in an unequal relationship to each other and to the state. And here you have an attempt being made after World War II to do away with, or at least reduce, inequality without eliminating the frank acceptance of difference or the frank acceptance of connectivity. And you're trying to see how a colonial empire that was thoroughly structured around inequality and repression and exploitation could be transformed into another kind of complex polity with a complex notion of sovereignty. Some sovereignty is something more than you either had or didn't have. So these are issues which take place in very specific circumstances, and which I try to discuss as they happen in real time, but which raise issues, I think, that are quite relevant beyond the intermediate case, and very relevant in France and in Africa and other parts of the world today. Thank you for your attention.